The bus was empty at 11:30 at night. Just the hum of the engine, the flicker of yellow lights overhead, and Bob Hayes sitting alone in the driver's seat with a worn canvas bag beside him. He'd been driving this last route for 8 years. The same streets, the same stops, the same moment when he'd pull over at the station where everything changed. Every night, he opened that bag. Every night, he touched the scarf inside. Every night, he remembered the phone call, her voice shaking, afraid, asking him what to do. Tonight, a young woman got on at the downtown stop, her eyes tired, her coat pulled tight against the cold. 2 men followed her on 3 stops later, loud voices cutting through the quiet, the smell of alcohol thick in the air. Bob glanced at the rearview mirror. His hands found the worn fabric of the bag. He'd learned something 8 years ago, something that still woke him at 2 in the morning. There are moments you can't take back. But maybe, just maybe, there are moments you can face again. Bob Hayes had been an engineer once. He'd worked in a glass tower downtown, wore pressed shirts, carried a briefcase that cost more than his weekly groceries. He'd been good at it too, solving problems, fixing systems, making things work. But 8 years ago, on a February night when the temperature dropped to 20 degrees and the streets turned to ice, everything he thought he knew about fixing things fell apart. Diane had called him at 11:45. He'd been in a meeting, the kind that ran late because everyone wanted to prove they worked harder than everyone else. His phone buzzed on the conference table. He'd glanced at it, seen her name, and let it go to voicemail. She'd called again. He'd excused himself, stepped into the hallway, and answered with the impatience of someone who had more important things to do. "What's wrong?" he'd said. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "What do you need?" Just impatience wrapped in 2 words. Her voice had been small, tight with fear. "Bob, I'm on the bus. There are these 2 men. They keep looking at me. They're saying things." He'd heard the fear, but he'd also heard the meeting continuing without him. The voices through the glass discussing the project he was supposed to be leading. "Just stay on the bus," he'd told her. "Stay near the driver. You'll be home in 15 minutes. I'll see you soon." She'd said, "Okay," in a voice that told him she wanted him to say more, to tell her it would be fine, to stay on the phone with her. But he'd already been walking back to the conference room, already thinking about the presentation he needed to finish. "I love you," she'd said. "Love you too," he'd replied, and hung up. 14 minutes later, his phone rang again. This time it was a police officer. Diane had gotten off the bus 3 stops early. She'd been running across the street toward the station, looking back over her shoulder when a truck came around the corner. The driver never saw her. By the time Bob got to the hospital, she was already gone. The funeral had been small. Diane's sister had flown in from Oregon, and a few friends from the neighborhood had come. Bob had stood by the casket in a suit that suddenly felt too big, listening to a minister talk about God's plan and eternal rest, and all he could think about was that phone call, the fear in her voice. The way she'd said, "I love you," like she needed to hear him say it back with meaning. He'd quit his job 2 weeks later, didn't give notice, didn't care about the severance package. He'd just walked into his boss's office and said he was done. His boss had tried to talk him out of it, said he was making a mistake, that grief did strange things to people. Bob had looked at him and thought about all the meetings, all the late nights, all the times he'd chosen work over the person who mattered most. "I'm already done," he'd said, and left. He'd spent 6 months in the apartment, barely eating, barely sleeping, just sitting on the couch with the television on, showing nothing he actually watched. Diane's things were still everywhere, her coffee mug in the kitchen, her books on the nightstand, her shoes by the door. He couldn't move them. Moving them would mean accepting she wasn't coming back, and accepting that felt like betrayal. One night, he'd been flipping through channels when he saw a news story about a woman assaulted on public transit. The reporter had said the driver hadn't intervened, hadn't called for help, had just kept driving. Bob had stared at the screen, something cold and sharp settling in his chest. He'd thought about that night, about the driver who must have seen those men, who must have heard Diane's fear, who'd let her get off the bus alone into the dark. The next morning, he'd walked to the transit authority office and asked about becoming a driver. The training had taken 3 months. He'd learned the routes, the schedules, the rules about passenger safety and emergency procedures. His instructor had been a man named Frank. 60 years old, with a face like worn leather and a voice rough from decades of smoking. "Why you want to do this?" Frank had asked him during one of their practice runs. "You don't seem like the type." Bob had kept his eyes on the road. "Just need a change," he'd said. Frank had nodded, not pushing it. "Well, you're good at it. Careful, aware. Most folks don't pay attention to what's happening behind them. You do." Bob hadn't told him why. Hadn't told him about Diane, about the phone call, about the guilt that sat in his chest like a stone he couldn't swallow. He'd just driven, and watched his mirrors, and made sure every passenger who got on his bus got off safely. He'd been assigned the late-night routes, 11 p.m. to 3 a.m., Thursday through Monday. Most drivers hated the overnight shift, the drunks, the trouble, the empty streets that made every minute feel longer. Bob had requested it. These were the hours when Diane had died. These were the hours when people were most vulnerable, most afraid, most likely to need someone paying attention. He'd driven the same route for 8 years now. Downtown to the north side, 23 stops, an hour and 15 minutes if traffic was light. Every night, he pulled over at the station on 5th and Morrison at exactly 12:47 a.m. That was where it had happened, where Diane had gotten off, where she'd run, where the truck had hit her. He'd sit there for 60 seconds, engine idling, and open the canvas bag she'd been carrying that night. The police had given it to him with her other belongings. Inside was her scarf, the blue one he'd bought her for Christmas 2 years before she died, a book she'd been reading, and her phone. The screen cracked from the impact. He'd touch the scarf, feel the soft wool between his fingers, and imagine that if he'd just sat there long enough, she'd get back on the bus and everything would reset. Tonight had started like every other night. He'd clocked in at 10:45, done his vehicle inspection, and pulled out at 11 sharp. The first hour had been quiet. A few people getting off late shifts, a college student with headphones in, an older man who always rode to the end of the line and back, just for something to do. Bob knew most of his regulars by sight, if not by name. The young woman had gotten on at 11:32 at the downtown stop near the business district. She'd looked tired in the way people look when they've been working too long for too little. Mid-20s, dark hair pulled back, a coat that had seen better winters. She'd paid her fare, offered him a small, tired smile, and moved toward the back. Bob had watched her in the mirror as she sat down 3 rows from the rear exit, pulled out her phone, and leaned her head against the window. 2 stops later, the men had gotten on. Bob had smelled them before he'd seen them. Alcohol and cigarette smoke, the sharp, sour smell of people who'd spent hours in a bar. They'd stumbled up the steps, laughing too loud, slapping bills on the fare box without bothering to straighten them. The taller one wore a leather jacket and had a tattoo creeping up his neck. The shorter one had a baseball cap turned backward and kept hitting his friend's shoulder like everything was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. They'd moved toward the back, their voices carrying through the bus. Bob had glanced at the mirror. The young woman had noticed them. She'd stopped looking at her phone, her posture changing, shoulders pulling in. He'd seen this before. Not in person. He'd never been there when Diane needed him. But he'd seen it enough times in 8 years to recognize it. The way someone's body language shifted from relaxed to guarded. The way eyes tracked movements without seeming to. The way people suddenly became very interested in their phones, in the window, in anything that meant not making eye contact. Bob's hands had tightened on the wheel. 4 more stops until the station where Diane had died. He'd started counting them in his head. The men had taken seats across from the young woman, still laughing, still loud. Bob had kept watching. One of them had said something Bob couldn't quite hear, and the other had laughed. The young woman hadn't reacted, just kept her eyes on her phone, but Bob saw her thumb wasn't moving anymore. She wasn't reading. She was just staring. At the next stop, an elderly couple got off, and suddenly the back of the bus was just the young woman and the two men. No witnesses, no buffer. Bob's heart had started beating faster. The taller man had leaned across the aisle. "Hey," he'd said, loud enough for Bob to hear. "Hey, you deaf?" The young woman had looked up, her expression carefully neutral. "I'm sorry?" Her voice had been steady, but Bob heard the edge underneath it. "We're talking to you," the shorter man had said. "You too good to talk to us?" She'd looked back at her phone. "I'm just trying to get home." The taller man had laughed. "Aw, don't be like that. We're just being friendly." They'd moved closer, taking the seats directly behind her now. Bob had watched the woman's reflection in the mirror. She'd glanced toward the front of the bus, toward him, and he'd seen the question in her eyes, the same question Diane must have had. Is anyone going to help? Or am I alone in this? Bob's hand had moved to the canvas bag beside him. His fingers had found the scarf inside, the fabric worn soft from 8 years of him holding it every night. He'd thought about Diane in that moment, about the phone call, about her voice asking him what to do. He'd told her to stay on the bus, to trust that staying would keep her safe. But staying hadn't kept her safe. The driver hadn't helped. The driver had just driven. And Diane had been so scared she'd run into the dark rather than stay one more minute on a bus where no one would protect her. Bob had made a decision then. He'd reached up and pressed the intercom button. His voice had come through the speakers, calm and clear. "Folks in the back, I'm going to need you to keep it down and respect other passengers." The men had looked up, surprised someone was paying attention. The taller one had sneered. "Mind your business, old man. Just drive the bus." Bob had kept his eyes on the road, but his jaw had tightened. The young woman had looked toward the front again, hope and fear mixed in her expression. She'd pressed the stop button for the next station. Bob had seen it light up on his dashboard. She was getting off, just like Diane. She'd rather take her chances in the dark than stay. The next stop was coming up, a corner with a closed gas station and a vacant lot, streetlights flickering, nobody around. If she got off there, if those men followed her, Bob would be driving away. Just like the other driver had driven away from Diane. He'd slowed for the stop, pulling to the curb. The doors had hissed open. Cold air had rushed in. The young woman had stood up, clutching her bag. The men had stood up too. "Where you going, sweetheart?" the shorter one had said. "Party's just getting started." She'd frozen, looking at the dark street outside, then back at them blocking the aisle. Bob had watched it all in the mirror, the fear, the calculation, the trapped feeling. He'd thought about the phone call, about Diane's voice, about the question she'd never asked but he'd heard anyway. "Are you going to help me, or am I on my own?" Bob had stood up. He'd left the driver's seat, left the bus idling at the curb with the doors open, and walked down the aisle toward the back. He wasn't a big man, 5'9", 170 pounds. Most of it settled in his middle now. He didn't look threatening. He looked like what he was, a 58-year-old man who drove a bus for a living. But something in his eyes, something in the way he moved, made the two men pause. "She's getting off," Bob had said quietly. "You're staying on." The taller man had laughed, but it sounded uncertain. "Says who?" Bob had stopped 2 feet away from them, close enough to smell the alcohol, to see the glassiness in their eyes. "Says me. You can ride to the end of the line, or you can get off here. But you're not following her." The shorter man had puffed up, trying to look tough. "You gonna make us, old man?" Bob had thought about Diane, about the hospital, about sitting beside her bed, holding her hand, while machines beeped and nurses whispered. He'd thought about 8 years of driving this route, of stopping at that station every night, of touching her scarf and wondering what if. What if he'd left the meeting? What if he'd told her to wait? He'd come get her. What if he'd stayed on the phone with her? What if someone had been there who cared enough to help? Yeah, Bob had said softly. I am. The young woman had moved then, slipping past them while they were focused on Bob, hurrying down the aisle toward the front. Bob had backed up, keeping himself between her and the men, moving slowly so he didn't trigger anything stupid. The taller man had taken a step forward, and Bob had raised his hand. Not aggressive, just firm. Don't, he'd said. Something in his voice had stopped the man. Maybe it was the steadiness. Maybe it was the lack of fear. Or maybe it was something else. The look of a man who'd already lost everything that mattered and had nothing left to be afraid of. The young woman had reached the front of the bus. She'd looked back at Bob, her eyes wide. Go, he'd told her. I've got this. She'd hesitated for just a second, then jumped down the steps and ran. Not across the street this time. Down the sidewalk, toward lights, toward people, toward safety. Bob had watched her go, relief flooding through him. She was safe. This time, someone had gotten away. Safe. He'd turned back to the two men. They'd moved closer together, uncertain now, the alcohol wearing thin against something they didn't understand. Next stop's in 2 minutes, Bob had said. You're getting off there. The shorter man had started to argue, but the taller one had grabbed his arm. Forget it, man. Crazy old guy's not worth it. They'd sat down heavily, muttering to themselves, and Bob had walked back to the driver's seat. His hands had been shaking. He'd gripped the wheel to steady them, pulled the doors closed, and driven to the next stop. When the doors opened, the two men had gotten off without a word, disappearing into the night. Bob had sat there for a moment, the bus empty again, just him and the hum of the engine and the worn canvas bag on the passenger seat. His heart had been pounding, adrenaline making his fingers tingle. He'd reached over and opened the bag, pulled out Diane's scarf, pressed it against his face. It didn't smell like her anymore. 8 years had taken that away. But he could remember. He could remember her wearing it, smiling at him across the breakfast table, saying she loved how soft it was. He could remember her voice on the phone, scared and alone. He could remember failing her. But tonight, he hadn't failed. Tonight, someone's husband or father or friend would get a phone call, and it would just be someone saying they got home safe. Nothing dramatic, nothing tragic, just safe. Maybe that was all he could do. Maybe that was enough. He'd finished his route that night, dropped the bus at the depot at 3 a.m., and clocked out. He'd driven home in his old sedan, parked in the same spot he'd parked in for 15 years, and climbed the stairs to the same apartment he'd shared with Diane. Her things were still there. He'd never been able to put them away. Her mug in the kitchen, her books on the shelf, her shoes by the door, waiting for feet that would never wear them again. Bob had made himself a cup of tea, sat on the couch in the dark, and thought about the young woman. Wondered if she'd made it home. Wondered if she'd told anyone what happened. Wondered if she even realized how close it had been. The next night, Bob had clocked in at 10:45, done his inspection, and pulled out at 11 sharp. Same route, same stops. Same moment at 12:47, when he pulled over at the station on 5th and Morrison and opened the canvas bag to touch Diane's scarf. But something was different. For 8 years, sitting at that station had felt like punishment, like penance for failing her. Tonight, it felt like something else, like memory, like honoring her, like trying to be the person she'd needed him to be. Even if he couldn't do it for her, maybe he could do it for someone else. He'd sat there for his 60 seconds, then closed the bag and drove on. The route had been quiet that night. A few passengers. Nobody causing trouble. At the downtown stop at 11:32, right on schedule, Bob had glanced out at the street, almost expecting to see her, the young woman from the night before. She wasn't there. Of course she wasn't. She'd probably never take this bus again. Probably never wanted to think about last night again. But at 11:35, 3 minutes late, someone had run up to the stop. Bob had opened the doors, and the young woman had climbed on, breathing hard from running. She'd paid her fare, then stopped, looking at him. "Hi," she'd said. He'd nodded. "Evening." She'd hesitated, then said, "I just wanted to say thank you for last night." Bob had felt his throat tighten. "You made it home okay?" "Yeah," she'd said. "Thanks to you." She'd smiled, a real smile this time, not the tired one from the night before. "I was scared I'd have to find another way home. But then I thought, you'll be here. You're here every night, right?" Bob had nodded again, not trusting his voice. She'd moved toward the back, and he'd watched her in the mirror as she sat down, relaxed this time, pulling out a book instead of her phone. She'd felt safe. On his bus, she'd felt safe. Something in Bob's chest had loosened, just a little. Not the grief. That would always be there, heavy and permanent. But the guilt, the crushing weight of failure, it had shifted. Maybe he hadn't saved Diane. Maybe he'd failed when it mattered most. But he'd been there for this young woman. He'd been the person who helped instead of the person who looked away. Maybe that's what the last 8 years had been about. Not punishment, not penance, but learning. Learning what it meant to actually be there when someone needed help. The rest of the night had passed without incident. Bob had driven his route, stopped at each station, watched his passengers in the mirrors. At 12:47, he'd pulled over at 5th and Morrison. He'd opened the canvas bag and touched Diane's scarf, like he did every night. But tonight, for the first time in 8 years, he'd said something. Just 3 words. Barely a whisper. "I'm trying, Di." The engine had hummed. The streetlights had flickered. The city had moved around him, indifferent to one man's grief and hope. And Bob had sat there, holding his wife's scarf, and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness, not peace, but purpose. The 60 seconds had passed. He'd closed the bag, put the bus in gear, and driven on. 2 months later, Bob had been driving the same route when he'd noticed a young man sitting near the front, fidgeting with his phone, glancing back toward a woman sitting alone near the middle. The woman had looked uncomfortable, changing seats twice. Bob had watched in the mirror, seeing the pattern. At the next stop, he'd called out, "Hey buddy, come on up here." The young man had looked surprised. "Me?" "Yeah, you. Come talk to me for a minute." The young man had moved to the front, and Bob had asked him about nothing in particular. The weather, the game on TV, anything to keep him occupied. When the woman had gotten off 2 stops later, safe and unbothered, she'd glanced at Bob with grateful eyes. He'd nodded to her. The young man had never even noticed. This became Bob's routine. Watching. Intervening when needed. Sometimes it was obvious. Drunk people getting aggressive, creepy behavior, threats. Those times he'd be direct, firm, using his authority as the driver. But more often it was subtle, moving people around with polite requests, calling passengers up to talk, taking different routes when he sensed trouble, creating distance and safety without making a scene. Frank, his old instructor, had ridden Bob's route one night, just checking in on former students. He'd watched Bob work for an hour, then said as he got off, "You're good at this, real good. You see things most drivers don't." Bob had shrugged. "Just paying attention." Frank had studied him for a moment. "There's a story there," he'd said. "Probably a sad one." Bob hadn't answered. Frank had nodded. Well, whatever it is, you're using it right. That matters. Diane's sister called once a month, checking on him. Her name was Ruth, and she lived in Oregon with her husband and 2 kids. She'd been after Bob for years to move out of the apartment, to start dating, to do something with his life besides drive a bus and live in memories. She wouldn't want this for you, Ruth had said during one call. She'd want you to be happy. Bob had thought about that, about what Diane would want. She'd been practical, unsentimental in most things. She'd probably agree with Ruth. But Bob couldn't imagine being someone else, living some other life. This was his life now. This route, this bus, these passengers, these chances to be there when it mattered. I am doing something, he'd told Ruth. I'm helping people. Ruth had sighed. Bob, you can't save everyone. You can't make up for— I know, he'd interrupted. I know I can't save everyone, but I can try. The line had been quiet for a moment. Then Ruth had said softly, She'd be proud of you. You know that, right? Bob had felt tears sting his eyes. I hope so, he'd said. 5 years into driving the route, Bob had been sitting at a red light when a police car had pulled up beside him. The officer in the passenger seat had rolled down his window and gestured for Bob to do the same. You're Bob Hayes, right? The officer had asked. Bob had nodded, uncertain. You drive this route every night? Yeah, why? The officer had smiled. We've been getting reports, good reports. People saying you watch out for them, keep them safe. Just wanted to say we appreciate it. Makes our job easier. Bob hadn't known what to say. The light had turned green, and the police car had driven off, leaving Bob sitting there feeling something warm and unexpected. Recognition. Not for failing, but for trying. Not for what he'd lost, but for what he'd chosen to do with that loss. The years had passed. Bob had turned 60, then 62. His hair had gone completely gray. His knees ached after long shifts. He'd thought about retirement sometimes, about what he'd do with his days. But every time he considered it, he'd think about the passengers who relied on his route, on his attention, on his presence. He'd think about the young woman who'd come back to his bus because she felt safe there. He'd think about Diane, about the promise he'd never made out loud, but had been keeping for over a decade. I'll be there. For the people you would have wanted me to help, I'll be there. On the anniversary of Diane's death, Bob had taken the day off work, the only day all year he didn't drive. He'd gone to the cemetery, stood by her grave, and told her about his year, about the people he'd helped, about the trouble he'd prevented, about the quiet satisfaction of knowing that on his watch, people made it home safe. I wish I'd been there for you, he'd said to the headstone. I wish I'd left that meeting. I wish I'd stayed on the phone. I wish I'd told you I was coming to get you. The wind had moved through the trees, cold and steady. But I'm here now, for everyone else. I hope that means something. He'd stood there until the sun set, then driven back to the apartment, back to the life he'd built from grief and purpose. The young woman, her name was Claire, he'd learned after she'd been riding his bus for a month, had eventually stopped taking the late-night route. She'd gotten a better job with normal hours. On her last night, she'd stopped by the driver's seat before getting off. I'm starting a new position next week, she'd said. Morning shift, so I won't need the night bus anymore. Bob had smiled. That's great. Congratulations. She'd hesitated, then said, I just wanted to say, that first night, I was so scared. I thought about getting off running. My mom always told me to trust my instincts, and my instinct was to run. Why didn't you? Bob had asked. Because I saw you watching, she'd said simply. In the mirror. You were paying attention. And I thought, if something happens, he'll do something. He won't just drive away. She'd paused. I was right. So thank you for being the kind of person who doesn't just drive away. Bob had watched her walk away into her new life, and he'd felt it again. That loosening in his chest, that sense of purpose. He'd failed Diane. That was a fact he'd carry forever. But he hadn't failed Claire. He hadn't failed the dozens of other passengers who'd ridden his bus over the years, who'd made it home safe because someone was watching. Someone cared. Maybe that was the point. Maybe grief didn't have to be just weight and pain. Maybe it could be transformed into something else. Not better. Loss was loss, and nothing fixed that. But different. Purposeful. A way of honoring what was lost by protecting what remained. That night, Bob had driven his route with a quiet contentment he hadn't felt in years. At 12:47 a.m., he'd pulled over at the station on 5th and Morrison, right on schedule. He'd opened the canvas bag and pulled out Diane's scarf, running his fingers over the soft blue wool. "I met someone today who reminded me of you," he'd said to the empty bus, to the memory, to the ghost that lived in his heart. "She was scared, and I helped her, and she's okay now. She's going to be okay." The streetlights had cast long shadows through the windows. The city had hummed its endless night song. "I couldn't help you," Bob had whispered. "I'll never forgive myself for that. But I'm helping them. Everyone I can. Every night. For you." He'd folded the scarf carefully, placed it back in the bag, and closed it. Then he'd put the bus in gear and continued his route, carrying his grief and his purpose forward into the dark, watching his mirrors, seeing his passengers, being there when it mattered, being there the way he should have been for her, being there because she couldn't be there anymore, and someone had to fill that space where love and protection should live. The bus had rolled on through empty streets, past closed shops and sleeping neighborhoods, carrying its driver and his ghosts and his promise. And in the back, in the seat where people sat when they felt safest, the overhead light had flickered once, then held steady. Bright and warm in the darkness,